A bed of iron, 9 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, roughly 13 feet by 6, give or take the length of the cubit used by the craftsman who shaped it. Deuteronomy records its location with the precision of someone who expects to be verified. It stands in Rabbath of the Ammonites. A bed preserved as evidence the text implies, for whoever might later need to understand the scale of what had already been removed from the world. What the text does not explain, what it leaves open in a way that never quite closes, is how something that large came to exist after the flood was said to have ended everything. That question is the one we are following tonight. What ancient texts suggest about the world after the flood is not a single settled picture. It is a layered accumulation of detail across Genesis, across Deuteronomy, across the books of Enoch and Jubilees, across Josephus and the rabbinical tradition, and eventually across the mythological archives of cultures that should not by any logic of geography remember the same things. Tonight we will move through 3 traces. The first follows the bloodline, how the record accounts for the reappearance in the very territory the flood was meant to cleanse of beings whose origin the texts describe with a mixture of matter-of-factness and deep unease. The second traces the transmission of knowledge, what the Watchers are said to have taught before their binding, and why the law codes that follow appear item by item to be answering those teachings directly. The third moves through the mythology itself, the flood narratives, the divine human unions, the giant clans remembered by cultures separated by oceans and millennia, and the quiet problem of what that convergence might mean. We will not resolve these questions. That is not what this space is for. What the texts establish in the opening chapters of the post-flood world is not comfort. Noah descends from the ark into a landscape that has been, according to the account, physically remade. Mountains stand where none existed before. Rivers have cut new channels. 8 people inherit everything. And then very quickly something goes wrong. It does not happen all at once. The early chapters read almost like administrative record keeping a covenant, a sign in the sky, a census of nations spreading across the renewed earth in orderly genealogical lines. 70 original people groups, territories assigned, languages eventually distributed. The world being repopulated according to a pattern that appears on the surface structured and deliberate, but the structure does not hold. What the Table of Nations actually describes when read alongside the Babel account that follows is not a voluntary dispersal. It is the aftermath of a forced one. The languages mentioned for each clan did not develop naturally over centuries. They were imposed in a moment. The text is explicit about this because humanity had gathered in one place and begun constructing something that the narrative treats with unusual urgency as a problem requiring immediate intervention. A tower, a unified language, an ambition that the text frames not as impressive but as dangerous. The name that stands at the centre of that project may be the most quietly significant in the entire post-flood narrative. Nimrod, a grandson of Ham, a great-grandson of Noah. The text calls him the first on earth to be a mighty man, and that phrase first on earth carries weight that translation does not quite capture. Before the flood, the Nephilim were described in nearly identical language, mighty men, men of renown. After the flood's supposed cleansing, Nimrod reclaims that title. He does not inherit it. He is the first, as though the category had been emptied, and he is the one who refills it. Josephus, writing centuries later, adds a layer. The Genesis text withholds. Nimrod, he suggests, gradually changed the existing order. He convinced people that their security came from their own effort, not from the covenant that had just been made. He taught them to attribute their safety to his walls, his organization, his power. The detail is small, and it refuses to go away. What the ancient texts suggest about this period is not a simple story of survival and rebuilding. It is something stranger, a world in which the specific conditions that preceded the flood forbidden knowledge transmitted downward beings of unusual origin establishing dominance over populations. The corruption of the territories that mattered most begin reassembling themselves within a handful of generations of the event that was supposed to have ended them. The Anakim appear in the hill country of Canaan. The scouts sent by Moses encounter them and return describing men of such height that the Israelite explorers felt by their own account like grasshoppers in comparison. The text does not leave this metaphorical. It names the genealogy directly. These are the sons of Anak who come from the Nephilim. not from Nephilim figuratively, from them, how the flood was by every account comprehensive. And yet here in the territory promised to Abraham's descendants stands a population carrying the same ancient descriptor that Genesis 6 used before the deluge. Some scholars argue this represents scribal inflation, the natural tendency of ancient historians to cast their enemies in the largest possible terms. That argument deserves weight. The distance between a tall man and something genuinely other is significant, and the texts themselves do not always make clear which they mean. But it does not dissolve the observation. The record preserves the shape of the question, without resolving what it meant. Tonight we hold three threads at once. We hold the bloodline question, the iron bed, the six-fingered warrior of Gath, the genealogy that the conquest accounts trace backward towards something older than the flood itself. We hold the knowledge question, the list of what was taught before the binding, and the list of what was later prohibited, and the way those two lists mirror each other with an accuracy that may or may not be coincidence. And we hold the mythology question, the flood accounts that arrive from more than 200 cultures that should not agree, and the precise details across those accounts that should not match. Not proof, a pattern. So we follow the first trace back to the moment the door of the ark opened, and 8 people stepped into a world that was clean and entirely unprepared for what was already moving toward it. The architecture of the New World. The mountains of Ararat rise to over 16,000 feet. In the second month of Noah's 601st year, the covering of the ark came off, and the air that met 8 people was not the air they had sealed themselves away from. It carried nothing of the old world, no smoke from cities, no sound of movement, no trace of the civilization that had taken centuries to build and apparently less than a year to vanish beneath water. What greeted them was a kind of silence that has no modern equivalent. Not the silence of a quiet room or a forest at night, but the silence of an absence so total that it had a texture. Genesis documents what followed with the economy of a ledger. Noah builds an altar. He selects clean animals and clean birds and offers them. The text records a divine response, a decision, a promise, and then it moves forward with the brisk efficiency of someone who has more to cover. The covenant is established. Seasons will hold. The patterns of cold and heat, seed time and harvest will not be interrupted again, regardless of what humanity chooses to do within them. A rainbow into the clouds will serve as the sign. What the text does not dwell on, but what becomes increasingly relevant as the chapters accumulate, is the architecture of this new arrangement. Before the flood, the relationship between human conduct and cosmic intervention had a kind of direct proportionality. Wickedness rose, judgment followed. The covenant resets that equation. Divine forbearance becomes structural, the waters will not return. But the text is equally clear that this does not mean human nature has been altered. The Creator acknowledges this explicitly, almost in passing. The intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. The promise of no further flood is made not because humanity has been improved, but in spite of the fact that it has not been. This is the foundation on which everything that follows is built. A world guaranteed against one particular form of catastrophic correction, populated by 8 survivors carrying the same interior architecture as everyone who drowned. Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth, begin producing children. The population expands. Within a few generations, what the text calls the Table of Nations emerges, 70 original people groups, each tracing its origin to one of the 3 brothers, each spreading outward into territories that the text names with a geographic specificity that has attracted the attention of historians for centuries. Many of the names correspond with demonstrable accuracy to peoples and regions that archaeology and linguistics have independently identified. The list is not random. It reads, as some scholars have noted, like an administrative document, a census taken at the moment of maximum dispersal before the cultures it names had time to diverge beyond recognition. What makes the Babel account strange on close reading is not the tower itself, but the stated motivation for building it. The builders were not claiming to attack heaven, they were claiming to prevent dispersal. Lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth, the text records them saying, they knew the command. They understood what they were supposed to do. They chose collectively and deliberately not to do it, and they framed their defiance not as rebellion, but as self-preservation. The tower reaching toward the sky was secondary. The city, the concentration, the unified name for themselves, these were the goal. The architecture was the means. Here is where the chronology becomes quietly remarkable. According to the genealogical sequence that runs through Genesis 11, Shem the son of Noah, the man who had walked out of the ark, was still alive when the events of Babel unfolded. He was still alive by the same reckoning when Abraham received his call in Ur of the Chaldees. The numbers allow for direct transmission. Shem could have spoken to Eber, from whose name the word Hebrew derives. Eber's descendants could have carried that conversation forward. The flood was not for the generations that followed it a distant myth requiring archaeological reconstruction. It was recent enough that its survivors were still breathing. And those survivors watched. They watched the world they had inherited, the one that had been by every account in the text wiped clean, begin reassembling the conditions that preceded its destruction. Not in the same form, not through the same mechanisms, at least not immediately, but the tendency was recognizable. The gathering at Shinar, the centralization of authority under a single powerful figure, the construction of a civilization oriented toward its own perpetuation, rather than toward the dispersal the covenant required. These were not novel patterns. They were familiar ones wearing new clothes. What the post-flood world did not do was forget. But neither the record suggested it learn in the way the flood might have been intended to teach. The dispersal from Babel scatters 70 groups across the map of the ancient world, each carrying fragments of a shared memory, each beginning the long process of cultural divergence that will eventually produce the mythological archives of Greece and Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley and the northern forests. What they carry with them, and what they do with what they carry, is the subject that waits in the following traces. We begin with the one the texts pursue most directly, the question of what crossed the boundary of the flood and where it went. Trace 1. The line that should not have continued. In the hill country west of the Jordan River, in a region the ancient texts identify as Hebron, 3 names appear with unusual specificity: Ahiman Shishai and Talmai, the sons of Anak. They are named as if their names matter, as if the record expects the reader to recognize the category they represent rather than simply the individuals. When Moses sends 12 men to scout the territory of Canaan before the Israelite advance, it is Hebron that the scouts single out, and it is these 3 figures they describe in terms that the text does not soften. The men of Anak are there, and in the same breath the scouts reach back across the boundary of the flood for the word in Nephilim. The genealogy the text constructs around this identification is worth following carefully because it is not incidental. The sons of Anak come from the Nephilim numbers 13 states. Anak's father was Arba, whom a later passage in Joshua identifies as the greatest man among the Anakim, great enough that the city of Hebron was originally named after him, Kiriath Arba, the city of Arba. The Anakim are thus presented not as a local people with unusual physical characteristics, but as a named lineage traceable with an implied origin that the text treats as both ancient and significant. They are not simply tall men in a land of tall men. They are something the record reaches for a specific word to describe, and the word it reaches for is the same one Genesis 6 used before the waters came. Genesis 6 is worth reading slowly on this point. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, the text says, and then it adds a phrase that has occupied interpreters for centuries and also afterward. Afterward. After the flood that was supposed to have ended everything. The phrase does not explain itself. It does not offer a mechanism, a genealogy, a theological account of how a category of being that was by all appearances swept away in a global deluge managed to reappear in the territory of Canaan several generations later. It simply notes the fact in the same declarative register the surrounding text uses for everything else, and moves on. The absence of explanation is itself a kind of data. Whoever assembled this account apparently did not find the reappearance surprising enough to require elaboration, or found it too difficult to explain, or was content to let the observation stand without resolution. The Book of Enoch, which is not canonical in most traditions, but which is quoted directly in the New Testament letter of Jude, and was clearly known to the communities that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, offers one account of the mechanism. When the Nephilim of the first generation died, some through the flood, some the text suggests through mutual violence that preceded it. Their disembodied spirits did not go where ordinary human souls went, being hybrids neither fully human nor fully angelic in the categories the text uses. they occupied an intermediate state. The Book of Jubilees adds a further detail. Mastema, the adversarial figure in that text's cosmology, petitioned for 1/10 of these spirits to remain active in the world rather than being bound. The petition the text claims was granted. 1/10 were left free to roam to tempt to teach, and the implication runs to prepare the conditions for a second incursion of the kind that produced the Nephilim in the first place. Whether one reads these texts as theological speculation, or as something the communities that preserved them believe to be historical record, the structural claim they make is consistent. The flood did not eliminate the source of the contamination, only one generation of its physical expression. The Watchers who had descended on Mount Hermon in the days of Jared, the text names 20 leaders among the 200 who bound themselves with oaths to proceed with what they understood to be a transgression, were imprisoned according to Enoch in the valleys of the earth. But imprisonment is not the same as annihilation, and the Book of Enoch is careful to note that while the original Watchers faced immediate binding, other members of the same class of being remained free, maintaining their assigned positions, or in some accounts, choosing at a later point to abandon them in the way their predecessors had. The second incursion, as the interpretive tradition constructs it, targets Canaan specifically, and this geographical specificity is not incidental. Canaan had been cursed in Noah's tent in an episode the text describes with deliberate opacity. Ham, the father of Canaan, had done something to Noah that the language suggests was an act, rather than merely an observation. The phrase knew what his youngest son had done to him implies consequence, not perception. Noah's curse falls not on Ham but on Canaan, his son, and the Jubilees tradition explains the displacement. Ham had already received a blessing as Noah's son, and the curse required a different recipient. Canaan's line in the generations that follow spreads into the coastal territories and the hill country that Noah's division of the earth had assigned to Shem's descendants, a territorial violation that the text frames as a second act of the same spirit that operated in the tent. The cursed line occupies the promised land, and into that occupied spiritually compromised territory, the second generation of giant-producing unions concentrates itself. The physical evidence that the tradition preserves is sparse but specific in ways that resist easy dismissal. The iron bed of Og, king of Bashan, 13 to 14 feet long by the standard cubit preserved in Rabbath of the Ammonites, where later generations could examine it, is presented as material record, not a narrative flourish. Joshua's campaign accounts name the 3 sons of Anak by their individual names as entities specific enough to require individual accounting. The summary statement at the close of Joshua's campaigns is precise in its geographical distribution. No Anakim remained in the land of Israel, but remnants survived in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod, 3 Philistine cities on the coastal plain outside the territory Joshua's campaign directly administered. The incompleteness is recorded, not concealed. Those 3 cities are where the bloodline trace goes next and where it waits for David. The remnant that escaped the conquest did not disappear. It rebuilt in the margins of the conquered territory and produced the warriors who would emerge a generation later, carrying the same descriptors descended from the giants, men of unusual size bearing weapons whose shaft was like a weaver's beam into conflicts that the texts treat as the final accounting of something that had begun long before the flood survived. It by means the record does not fully explain and required centuries of targeted elimination before it finally closed. Trace 2. The knowledge that outlasted the water. Consider what it means to prohibit something. Not to discourage it, not to regulate it or tax it or assign it to specialists, but to name it explicitly in a legal code and forbid it entirely, to single it out by category from everything else a community might do. Prohibition at that level of specificity implies familiarity. You do not write a law against a practice no one has encountered. The Levitical code, which the tradition presents as delivered to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, contains a list of prohibitions so particular in their targeting that they function less like general ethical guidance and more like a point-by-point response to something already in circulation. No divination, no sorcery, no consulting of mediums or spiritists, no inquiring of the dead, no carved images, no worship of celestial bodies. The list goes on item by item, naming practices with the precision of someone who knows exactly what they are prohibiting because they have seen it done. The Book of Enoch preserves what it presents as the corresponding list on the other side the curriculum. if that word can be stretched to fit that the Watchers delivered when they descended. The two lists read alongside each other produce an alignment that is either a remarkable coincidence of categories or something more structurally significant. Azazel teaches the making of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, the technology of organized warfare transferred to human hands. He teaches the working of metals, the extraction of ore from the earth, the processes of smelting and forging that would allow a population to produce weapons at scale, rather than relying on improvised implements. And alongside the military knowledge, the same figure teaches cosmetics, the use of harmony, the beautifying of eyelids, the arts of personal adornment that the text connects not incidentally to the seduction that preceded the unions producing the Nephilim in the first place. The knowledge of how to make weapons and the knowledge of how to make oneself attractive to beings who should not be attracted, these are presented as a single transmission delivered by the same teacher. Samjaza teaches spells and root cutting, the manipulation of spiritual forces through incantation, and the botanical knowledge of which plants produce which effects on the body and mind. The Enoch text is specific enough about this second category to imply something more than medicinal herbology. Root cutting in the ancient Near Eastern context encompassed abortifacients, hallucinogens, aphrodisiacs, the pharmacological arts that enable sexual activity without its natural consequences, or that alter consciousness in ways that facilitate contact with spiritual forces. Barakiel teaches astrology, Kokabiel teaches the signs of the constellations, Tamiel teaches astronomy in the service of divination. The reading of celestial movements not as the Creator's ordering of time and season, but as a map of fate available to those who know how to interpret it. Asaradel teaches the motion of the moon, the lunar cycles that paganism will elevate into the worship of the moon as a deity in its own right, and that the fertility cults of the ancient Near East will incorporate into their ritual calendars with a precision that required multi-generational astronomical observation to develop. What the Enoch list describes taken as a whole is not random instruction. It's a systematic program of self-sufficiency, a curriculum designed to convince its recipients that they do not need divine provision, divine protection, or divine guidance because they now possess the technical means to provide those things for themselves. You do not need to ask for healing, you have root knowledge. You do not need to trust in the patterns of the covenant, you have weapons to take what you need. You do not need revelation about the future. You have the stars and you have priests trained to read them. The knowledge does not simply corrupt, it replaces. It offers a complete alternative framework for operating in the world, one in which the practitioner is the agent rather than the recipient. This is where the Levitical prohibitions take on a different weight. Each item in the list of what is forbidden corresponds with a specificity that is difficult to account for as coincidence to a specific practice the Enoch tradition attributes to Watcher instruction. The prohibition against divination answers the teaching of astrology and celestial signs. The prohibition against sorcery answers the transmission of spells and incantations. The prohibition against consulting the dead answers the necromantic practices that the Canaanite religious system developed from the knowledge the texts attribute to forbidden sources. The prohibition against carved images answers the idolatrous frameworks that the dispersed nations constructed around the spiritual entities that had positioned themselves as the gods those nations worshipped. The law does not simply list what is wrong, it maps with the precision of someone who has seen the full curriculum, every practice that curriculum produced. The cultures that received this knowledge or that developed it through contact with the spiritual forces that Enoch tradition identifies as its original source did not keep it contained. The Canaanites became in the ancient world's own accounting unusually sophisticated practitioners of the magical arts. Their temple complexes housed systems of divination. Their priests maintained genealogies of technique passed through generations, with the care that other traditions reserved for astronomical records. Their metallurgy, which the conquest accounts note in the description of fortified cities built with a skill that impressed the Israelite scouts, corresponds to the Azazel transmission of metalworking knowledge. Egyptian tradition attributed the magical system of its priesthood to the gods directly. The gods who, in the framework the Enoch texts establish, were not independent divine beings, but fallen entities presenting themselves as such. The Babylonian reputation for astrology, which would remain proverbial for centuries, traces to a tradition of celestial observation that its own practitioners claimed had been delivered to them from above. Paul, writing to the Corinthians several centuries after the conquest accounts, makes a claim that carries the full weight of this framework without explaining it what pagans sacrifice. He says they sacrifice to demons and not to God. The idols are nothing stone, wood, metal without inherent power. But behind the idol stands something that accepts the worship and uses the connection it creates. The ancient religious systems were not in this reading. Human inventions that had wandered away from a dimly remembered truth. They were sustained, maintained, and occasionally guided by entities that had a structural interest in keeping their practitioners dependent. The knowledge they transmitted was functional enough to produce real results. Weather patterns shifted, harvests responded. Enemies fell because the entities delivering it had genuine capacity. The question the texts raise is not whether the knowledge worked. It is what the knowledge cost. What the law code preserved in Leviticus represents in this reading is not simply a set of ethical regulations for a community in formation. It is an inoculation, a systematic naming and prohibition of every practice in the Watcher curriculum designed to prevent the covenant community from accessing a system that was functional precisely because it was designed to be, and that carried within its functionality the same contamination that had required a flood to address once before. The flood had eliminated one generation of physical corruption. The law was attempting to prevent the intellectual and spiritual corruption from taking root again in the people through whom the counter-narrative was supposed to run. Whether the law succeeded is a question the subsequent history answers with uncomfortable honesty, and we will return to it. But first we need to sit with the third trace, the one that arrives, not from the texts of a single tradition, but from everywhere at once, speaking in languages that should not share a vocabulary, remembering events that should have been lost in the dispersal from Babel, carrying details specific enough to demand explanation. Trace 3. The memory that travelled without permission, 217. That is the number of distinct cultural traditions catalogued across independent ethnographic studies conducted through the 19th and 20th centuries that preserve some version of a catastrophic flood narrative. The figure is large enough to attract attention and ambiguous enough to resist easy interpretation. It is the kind of number that, depending on what framework you bring to it, either confirms everything or explains nothing. 217 traditions remembering a flood could mean that a single catastrophic event left traces in the collective memory of every human lineage that descended from survivors. It could also mean that floods are common, that river valley civilizations experience inundation regularly, and that the human mind organizes traumatic environmental events into a recognizable narrative shape regardless of whether the events themselves were related. Both readings are available. Neither one is obviously wrong. What makes the convergence harder to dismiss with the second explanation is not the flood itself, but the details that accompany it across traditions that had no plausible means of contact. The Mesopotamian account preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh older in written form than the Genesis account, though the relationship between the two is more complex than simple. Priority of inscription describes a righteous man warned of the coming water, a vessel constructed to specific dimensions, a landing on a mountain bird sent out to find dry land. The Greek account of Deucalion follows the same sequence with enough precision that early Christian writers were not troubled by the parallel. They treated it as confirmation rather than competition. The Hindu tradition of Manu preserves the same essential structure. A fish delivers a warning, a ship is built, the waters rise, the vessel finds a mountain, humanity begins again. The specificity of these parallels, not just flood, not just survival, but the sequence of warning construction animals, preserved, birds released, mountain landing, reaches beyond what the archetype theory comfortably accommodates. Archetypes explain why flood stories exist everywhere. They do not explain why the same bird appears in the same role in accounts separated by several thousand miles and several thousand years. The divine-human union accounts complicate the picture further, and in a direction that creates genuine discomfort rather than simple wonder. The Greeks remembered Zeus descending repeatedly to take human women, producing offspring of extraordinary capacity. Heracles, Perseus, Achilles, who were neither fully divine nor fully mortal, and who carried their composite nature as both gift and burden. The Norse tradition preserved the Jotnar giant beings of a different order than the Aesir gods, whose interactions with the human world produced figures of legendary power. The Hindu epics describe the Gandharvas and the Apsaras, semi-divine beings whose unions with humans created lineages that the texts treat as distinct from ordinary humanity. In each case, the offspring of these unions were characterized by the same cluster of attributes: unusual physical scale, extraordinary strength, appetites that exceeded what the world could sustain, and a violent relationship with the human populations around them. The Titans of Greece consumed their own children. The Rakshasas of the Hindu tradition hunted humans for food. The Jotnar of the Norse material existed in permanent destabilizing conflict with both gods and mortals. The pattern of insatiable consumption and violence that the Book of Enoch attributes to the Nephilim appears in recognizable form in mythological archives that had no access to that text. Here is where the complication becomes genuinely uncomfortable and where intellectual honesty requires holding two possibilities simultaneously rather than resolving the tension prematurely. The convergence across these traditions is real. It is documented. It is specific enough that scholars who began their careers committed to purely naturalistic explanations have spent considerable effort trying to account for it without invoking a common event. Diffusion theory. The idea that stories travel along trade routes and through migration handles some of the parallels. The Mesopotamian flood narrative likely influenced the Hebrew account, or both drew from an earlier common source. The scholarly consensus on this is stable and reasonable. But diffusion theory requires contact, and the contact required to explain the full distribution of these accounts across pre-Columbian America, across sub-Saharan Africa, across the island cultures of the Pacific is contact that the archaeological record does not support at the necessary dates and at the necessary scale. And yet the alternative that all of these traditions independently arrived at the same narrative structure, the same figure of the righteous survivor, the same birds, the same mountain, the same divine human offspring with the same characteristic violence asks something of coincidence that coincidence may not be able to provide. Neither explanation is fully adequate. This is the discomfort that the third trace produces, and it is worth naming clearly rather than smoothing over the global mythology record does not prove the biblical account of the Nephilim and the Watchers, but it also does not yield to the explanations that would make the convergence unremarkable. It sits between those two positions, and it has been sitting there for as long as scholars have been aware of the full distribution of the data. The six-fingered detail is perhaps the most arresting single point in this catalogue. The polydactyly of the Philistine giant at Gath, 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all, is noted in the text as a distinguishing characteristic. It appears in a handful of other ancient traditions in form specific enough to resist reduction to independent symbolic invention, describing beings of unusual stature with the same anatomical marker. Whether this represents a genuine genetic trait associated with a specific population, a detail too strange to have been independently invented multiple times, or something else entirely, the record does not say. What it does is raise a question that the comfortable explanations have not yet answered, and that the third trace leaves deliberately open as we move toward the place where all three converge. First convergence, 3 lines toward the same shape. Pull back from the individual traces for a moment and consider what they look like when placed beside each other, not as separate arguments, but as 3 independent lines of inquiry that happen to be pointing in the same direction. The first trace follows a bloodline through the post-flood record, a genealogy that the texts preserve with unusual specificity, naming individuals, cities, and physical characteristics across multiple books and centuries, arriving at a set of warriors in the Philistine coastal cities whose origin the same record traces back without ambiguity to the Nephilim of the pre-flood world. The second trace follows a body of knowledge, a curriculum attributed to specific teachers, prohibited item by item, in a legal code that corresponds to it with a precision that implies direct awareness of what is being countered. The third trace follows a pattern of memory distributed across cultures that should not share it, carrying details too specific to be accounted for by the usual mechanisms of narrative diffusion or psychological archetype. 3 lines, 3 different kinds of evidence, 3 different disciplines required to follow them, and when you set them beside each other, a shape begins to emerge that none of them individually produces. The shape is this something crossed the boundary of the flood, not as a single entity, not in a way that any one piece of evidence can locate precisely, but as a set of related phenomena, a physical lineage, a body of transmitted knowledge and a distributed cultural memory, each of which independently suggests that the event the ancient texts describe as a global reset was not in practice a complete erasure. The texts themselves do not hide this. Genesis 6's phrase, and also afterward, is not an accidental insertion. The Levitical Code's specific targeting of specific practices implies that those practices were available and in use, not theoretical. The 217 flood traditions imply not only that a flood happened, but that something about the world that followed it was sufficiently abnormal to require explanation across every culture that remembered the water at all. The convergence is not manufactured by reading the traces through a predetermined framework. It emerges from following each trace independently and then looking at where they end up. What makes this convergence uncomfortable, and it is important to hold the discomfort rather than resolve it prematurely, is that the three traces reinforce each other in a way that amplifies rather than simply accumulates. The bloodline trace by itself could be explained as scribal inflation, the tendency of ancient historians to mythologize their enemies. The knowledge trace by itself could be explained as the natural development of religious law in response to the practices of surrounding cultures with no supernatural transmission required. The mythology traced by itself could be explained as the product of shared psychological architecture and limited diffusion along trade routes. Each individual explanation is reasonable. What they cannot do individually is account for the fact that the same explanatory pressure applies simultaneously to three independent bodies of evidence pointing at the same underlying claim. The bloodline texts describe the same beings the mythology records remember. The knowledge the law code prohibits corresponds precisely to the knowledge the mythologies of traditions attribute to divine human transgression. The flood that 217 cultures remember is the event after which, in the text that preserve the bloodline, trace the phrase, and also afterward, appears. Here is the specific convergence point that the individual traces do not make visible on their own. In the Deuteronomy 32 passage known as the Song of Moses, the text describes the moment when the Most High divided the nations, the Babel dispersal, and states that he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of divine beings. This reading comes from the Septuagint and from the Dead Sea Scrolls fragment 4 QDEU T, where the Hebrew reads Beni Elohim rather than the Masoretic texts Beni Israel. The variant matters because it places spiritual entities the same class of being the Enoch tradition identifies as the source of the forbidden knowledge. Transmission at the organizational center of the post-Babel world order. Each dispersed nation received, according to this reading, an assigned overseer from the class of beings that had already demonstrated at Hermon a capacity for the kind of transgression the flood was meant to address. The knowledge, trace, the mythology trace, and the bloodline trace all converge on this single structural claim that the dispersal from Babel did not scatter humanity into a spiritually neutral landscape. It scattered them into a landscape already organized around entities with a history. The 70 nations of the Table of Nations correspond in the ancient Jewish interpretive tradition to 70 divine beings assigned at Babel. The 70 correspond in the same tradition to the 70 elders of Israel appointed in the wilderness. The number is not decorative. It marks a direct structural parallel between the divine council that organized the dispersed world and the human council that was supposed to represent an alternative form of governance within it. Israel was not assigned a divine overseer at Babel. The Song of Moses states this explicitly. The Lord's own portion is his people Jacob, his allotted heritage. The covenant people stood outside the organizational structure that governed every other nation, which means they also stood outside the network of knowledge transmission and spiritual dependency that structure maintained. The law code that prohibited divination sorcery and the consultation of spirits was not simply ethical guidance. It was a structural separation from a system that every surrounding nation was embedded in, whether or not those nations understood the nature of the embedding. What the three traces placed side by side suggest is that the post-flood world was not simply a rebuilt version of the pre-flood world with the worst elements removed. It was a rebuilt world in which the worst elements had reorganized themselves at a different level, less visible, more distributed, embedded in the cultural and religious architecture of the 70 nations rather than walking openly among them. The giants were the most visible expression of the problem, But they were not the problem itself, they were a symptom, and the flood had addressed the symptom without fully reaching the source. That is the shape the convergence produces, and it is the shape that the skeptic fairly and necessarily is now going to challenge. The counter-arguments deserve the floor. A fair investigation does not save its strongest objections for the footnotes. The case that has been building across the preceding chapters, the bloodline that crossed the flood, the knowledge curriculum and its legal mirror, the convergent mythology, rests on a set of interpretive choices that careful scholars have contested, and those contestations deserve to be heard in full, not summarized and dismissed. The intellectual honesty that this kind of inquiry requires is not the honesty of presenting objections before overcoming them. It is the honesty of presenting objections that genuinely complicate the picture, and leaving the complication intact. The first and most substantial objection concerns the giants themselves. The physical evidence for human beings of genuinely anomalous stature in the ancient Levant is by any fair accounting thin. Archaeological excavations in the territories the biblical texts associate with the Anakim have produced skeletal remains, showing some individuals in the range of 6.5 to 7 feet tall, certainly by the standards of ancient populations whose average male height clustered around 5 feet 4 or 5, but 7 feet is not what the texts appear to describe. The scouts who returned from Canaan reported feeling like grasshoppers beside the inhabitants. Og's bed, if the cubit used was the standard 18-inch measure, implies an occupant somewhere between 10 and 13 feet tall. No skeletal remains from the ancient Near East from any period approach those dimensions. The honest reading of the archaeological record is that it does not corroborate the scale the texts suggest. What it offers instead is a population of unusually tall people. In a region where Israelite scouts, possibly predisposed to fear by the political pressures of the moment, may have described in terms their audience would find maximally persuasive. Ancient military literature regularly inflated the stature of enemies to heighten the glory of their defeat. The Goliath narrative exists within a tradition that had strong institutional reasons to present David's victory as cosmically significant rather than simply fortunate. None of this means the giants did not exist. It means the texts describing them are doing literary and theological work alongside whatever historical reporting they contain, and separating those two functions is more difficult than the convergence argument acknowledges. The second objection targets the methodology of the mythological comparison. The 217 flood traditions are real. The parallels between the Mesopotamian Greek Hindu and biblical flood accounts are real and specific enough to require explanation beyond coincidence. But the explanation that requires the least additional assumption is diffusion. The movement of narratives along trade routes through migration and across cultural contact zones that were more extensive in the ancient world than the isolation model implies. The ancient Near East was not a collection of hermetically sealed cultures. Mesopotamian literary traditions influenced the Levant. The Levant influenced Egypt. Egypt influenced the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean world had contact with the Indian subcontinent along routes that functioned for millennia before the modern period. The bird detail in flood narratives from geographically distant cultures is striking, but birds sent to find land is also a logical procedure that any sailor facing an unknown horizon might independently develop and preserve in narrative form. The Jungian framework. The idea that certain narrative structures emerge from shared psychological architecture rather than shared history is not simply a way of avoiding the implications of the data. It is a genuine explanatory tool with documented applications in folklore studies, and dismissing it requires more than pointing to the specificity of the parallels. The 6-fingered giant detail which appears in a small number of traditions outside the biblical text is intriguing, but not by itself sufficient to establish a common event, rather than a common symbolic vocabulary for marking beings as outside the normal human category. The third objection is perhaps the most structurally significant because it concerns the primary source on which 2 of the 3 traces depend, the Book of Enoch. First, Enoch specifically, which supplies the names of the Watchers, the knowledge curriculum they transmitted, and the account of their binding, was composed by scholarly consensus sometime between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE. The oldest surviving complete manuscript is an Ethiopic translation from a Greek translation of what was likely an Aramaic original. It is not part of the Hebrew Bible canon. It is not part of the Protestant or Catholic Old Testament, It is quoted in Jude and appears to have been known to the community at Qumran, but its authority as a historical record of events preceding the flood is by any standard of documentary criticism considerably weaker than the texts that do occupy canonical status. The knowledge curriculum that the Levitical Code appears to answer so precisely the point-by-point correspondence between what the Watchers taught and what the law prohibits depends entirely on treating the Enoch tradition as preserving genuine pre-flood memory, rather than as a sophisticated theological construction produced by Second Temple Judaism to explain the origin of evil within a monotheistic framework. Both readings of the text are available. The second requires no supernatural transmission of forbidden knowledge, no angelic descent, no hybrid offspring. It requires only a community of writers working in a period of intense theological creativity, constructing a mythological genealogy for the practices they saw corrupting the nations around them. Each of these objections is genuine. Each addresses a real weakness in the convergence argument: the absence of skeletal corroboration, the availability of diffusions as an explanation for mythological parallels, the late date and non-canonical status of the primary source for the knowledge trace. The convergence argument does not dissolve under this pressure, but it does not emerge from it unchanged either. What remains after the objections have been fairly heard is not a proof, and it was never presented as one. What remains is a set of independent observations, a genealogy the texts preserve with unusual specificity, a legal code whose prohibitions correspond to a curriculum, the tradition attributes to a specific kind of transgression, a distributed mythology carrying details that diffusion theory handles imperfectly, that continue to point in the same direction even when the individual mechanisms proposed to explain them are questioned. The objections account for each trace separately. They have more difficulty accounting for the three together, and for the structural coherence that the convergence produces when the traces are read alongside each other rather than in isolation. That coherence is what remains on the table unresolved when the skeptic has finished speaking. What the objections leave standing. The objections made in the previous chapter were not rhetorical, they were real, and they should be carried forward rather than set aside now that the skeptic has finished speaking. The archaeological record does not produce skeletons of the scale the texts describe. The mythological parallels are explicable if not fully explained by diffusion. The Book of Enoch was composed centuries after the events it describes in a tradition with its own theological agenda. These points remain true regardless of what follows. The question is not whether the objections are valid, they are, but whether they account for everything the convergence produces, or whether something remains on the table after the accounting is done. That residue, whatever its nature, and whatever its ultimate explanation, is what this chapter is about. Begin with the Ugaritic texts. Ugarit was a coastal city in what is now northern Syria, destroyed around 1185 BCE in the same wave of disruption that collapsed the late Bronze Age world across the eastern Mediterranean. When archaeologists excavated the site beginning in 1929, they found a library of clay tablets in a language closely related to ancient Hebrew, predating the final composition of most of the biblical texts by several literatures. Among those tablets were ritual texts describing a category of beings called the Rafaim, not as legendary giants from a distant mythological past, but as participants in cultic ceremonies addressed in the second person invited to feast with the living, associated with a warrior aristocracy whose physical and social characteristics the texts distinguish from the ordinary human population around them. The Ugaritic Rafaim are not simply another word for the dead. They are a specific class carrying specific attributes functioning within a religious system that treated them as accessible and relevant rather than as historical memory. This is not a biblical source. It is an independent Bronze Age archive from a culture adjacent to but distinct from the Israelite tradition, preserving a category beings of unusual capacity associated with the pre-conquest inhabitants of the region that the biblical texts also preserve using the same name. Diffusion cannot easily account for the independent preservation of a specific named category across two traditions that were developing simultaneously in neighbouring but distinct cultural contexts. The Deuteronomy 32 variant deserves a second pass in the light the skeptic has cast. The scholarly debate about whether the original Hebrew read Ben Elohim or Ben Israel in verse 8 is not settled, but it is not simply a matter of ideological preference either. The Dead Sea Scrolls Fragment 4 QDEUT preserves Bein Elohim and the Septuagint. The Greek translation produced by Jewish scholars in Alexandria several centuries before the Common Era reads Angelon Theo, Sons of God. The Masoretic text, which became the standard Hebrew Bible, reads Bene Israel, and this reading has the weight of the rabbinic tradition behind it. The textual question is genuinely unresolved, but what the Ben Elohim reading produces, if accepted, is structural coherence of a kind that the Bene Israel reading does not. It places the organizational logic of the post-Babel world, the reason the nations developed the specific religious systems they did, the reason the knowledge the Enoch tradition attributes to Watcher transmission, appears independently in so many cultures within a single explanatory framework, rather than requiring separate explanations for each cultural development. The Bene Israel reading is simpler, but explains less. The Bene Elohim reading is more complex, but accounts for more of the data simultaneously. Neither reading proves anything about the supernatural reality of divine beings, but the coherence that one reading produces and the other does not is itself a form of evidence not about what happened, but about what the tradition was attempting to describe. There is also the matter of what the Book of Enoch is even granting the late composition date that the skeptic correctly identified. The Second Temple period produced a remarkable body of literature, much of it now gathered under the label of pseudepigrapha texts attributed to ancient figures written in their voice addressing questions that the canonical text left open. The Enoch tradition is part of this literature, and reading it as Second Temple theological construction rather than pre-flood historical record is a reasonable and well-supported scholarly position. But theological construction is not the same as invention from nothing. The community that produced First Enoch was working with traditions oral, textual and interpretive that it inherited from earlier periods. The Aramaic fragments of the Book of Giants found at Qumran, which describe the Nephilim and their activities in terms that overlap with, but are not identical to First Enoch, suggest that the Enoch tradition was drawing on a pool of material rather than constructing a framework from scratch. The question is not whether the Enoch texts preserve verbatim historical records. They do not claim to, and no serious scholar argues that they do. The question is whether the traditions they drew on preserved a genuine cultural memory of something distorted by the centuries of oral transmission and theological interpretation that lie between the event and the text. That question cannot be answered by pointing to the late composition date alone. What the objections leave standing then is this unnamed category of beings, the Rafaim preserved independently in Ugaritic and biblical traditions using the same term associated with the same region, carrying the same distinguishing characteristics. A textual variant in a foundational passage that, if original, produces a structural coherence, the alternative reading cannot match. A body of tradition behind the Enoch texts that is older than its written form, and that drew on sources the archaeological recovery has only partially reconstructed. None of these are proofs. Each is a point where the skeptical accounting runs short of the full distribution of the data, and where the pattern the convergence produces continues to hold its shape despite the pressure applied to it. The investigation does not claim more than that. But it does not claim less either, and with that balance restored we can move into the territory the convergence opens rather than the territory it closes. The geography of the arrangement. The territory promised to Abraham in Genesis 15 is described with boundaries that are by ancient Near Eastern standards unusually precise. From the river of Egypt to the Great River, the Euphrates encompassing the lands of the Canaanites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rafaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. 10 peoples, 10 territories. The list is not decorative, and the Rafaim appearing in the middle of it, surrounded by peoples whose existence is attested in the archaeological and textual record of the Bronze Age, is not an accident of placement. The territory that the covenant designates as Abraham's descendants' inheritance is defined in part by the sole presence of the very category of being whose origin the preceding traces have been following. The promised land is not empty land awaiting occupation. It is land currently organized around something the covenant is specifically designed to displace. What follows from this observation is a question about the geography itself, about whether the distribution of giant clans across the specific territories the conquest accounts describe was random, or whether it corresponded to something about the land's position within the covenant framework. The Anakim in the hill country of Hebron, the Rafaim east of the Jordan in Bashan, and the territories of Og, the Amim in the plains of Moab, the Zamzumim in the territory that would become Ammon. These are not scattered incidentally across the map of the ancient Near East. They cluster with a specificity that the conquest accounts preserve in careful geographical detail, precisely within the boundaries that Genesis 15 had designated as the inheritance. The surrounding territories, Egypt to the south, Mesopotamia to the east, the Hittite lands to the north, do not appear in the conquest accounts as strongholds of giant warrior clans. The concentration is local targeted, and corresponds with an accuracy that is difficult to attribute to coincidence to the exact region the Covenant had identified as the land through which the counter-narrative was supposed to run. The Isaiah 14 passage, which we have approached but not yet entered fully, gives this geographical concentration its most explicit ancient commentary. Isaiah is addressing Babylon, the empire that will eventually carry Judah into exile, that sits on the same Mesopotamian plain where Nimrod built the first post-flood kingdom, where the Zikrid of Babel once rose above a unified humanity committed to its own perpetuation. But the oracle's language shifts in a way that ancient readers clearly recognized as intentional, from the earthly king of Babylon to something that speaks from and to a larger register. How you are fallen from heaven, O day, star, son of dawn! The image is of a being that once held a position of light and elevation, that sought to ascend above the stars, to set its throne on the Mount of Assembly in the far reaches of the north, to make itself like the Most High, and that has instead been brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. The structural parallel to the Watcher tradition is precise enough that the communities who preserved both texts read them as connected, and the interpretive tradition that identified the day star figure with the adversarial entity behind the Watcher transgression was not a medieval Christian invention. It was present in the Second Temple period in the same communities that produced and preserved the Enoch literature. What makes the Isaiah passage relevant to the geography question is the detail that precedes the day star oracle. Sheol beneath the text says is stirred to meet you when you come. It stirs up the Rafaim for you all who are leaders of the earth. The Rafaim, the giant, clans, the beings whose physical presence in the hill, country, and east of the Jordan had defined the landscape of the promised land, are here located in the underworld, roused from whatever diminished existence they occupy there to witness the arrival of the fallen Babylonian king. The prophet is not reaching for a mythological flourish, he is invoking a category his audience knew as historically real beings who had genuinely dominated the territories of the ancient world, whose physical presence had shaped the geography of the conquest and whose current location in Sheol was the result of that conquest's completion. Their presence in the underworld is the consequence of David's campaigns of Joshua's systematic elimination of the giant strongholds of the centuries-long process by which the concentrated hybrid lineages in the Promised Land were one by one removed from the land above and relocated in the text's cosmology to the realm below. The Rafaim in Sheol speak in Isaiah's oracle, "You too have become as weak as we," they say to the descending Babylonian king. "You have become like us." The irony that the prophet constructs here operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The king who claimed divine status, who built his empire on the same Mesopotamian plain, where the first post-flood rebellion organized itself under Nimrod, who treated his power as self-sufficient and his civilization as permanent, that king is now joining the beings who made the same claim from a different register. The giants believed their size and strength placed them beyond the reach of ordinary human opposition. They were wrong, and the hill country of Hebron and the territories east of the Jordan are where they found out. The Babylonian king believed his walls and his armies and his gods placed him beyond accountability. Isaiah's oracle is the announcement that he is about to find out the same thing in the same place, Sheol, where the Rafaim are already waiting to receive him with a recognition that contains in the prophet's construction something almost like bitter humour. They have been there long enough to know exactly what the king's arrival means. What the expansion of the picture across Isaiah's oracle adds to the convergence is not simply another piece of evidence. It adds a temporal dimension that the earlier traces did not fully supply. The bloodline trace followed the giant lineages forward from the flood to David. The Isaiah passage picks them up after David preserved in a new form diminished, located in the underworld, stripped of the physical presence that made them the defining feature of the landscape, and uses their fate as the template for understanding how every system that follows the same logic will eventually resolve. The giants are gone from the surface of the world, but they are not absent from the world the texts construct. They remain as a reference point of before and after that the prophetic tradition reaches for when it wants to communicate what a certain kind of power, a certain kind of claim to self-sufficiency ultimately produces. The land above is cleared. What is below is still carrying the memory of how the clearing happened and what it cost. The silence where the explanation should be. The genealogy in Genesis 11 is precise enough to permit a calculation that the text never makes explicit, presumably because it expected its readers to make it themselves. Shem, the son of Noah, was born before the flood and died, according to the chronological record, 600 years after it. Abraham left Haran at the age of 75. Working backward through the genealogical sequence that runs from Shem to Abraham, the specific years recorded at each paternal birth accumulated without gaps. The calculation produces a result that the text seems to hide in plain arithmetic. Shem outlived Abraham's father Terah. He was still alive by the numbers the text provides when Abraham walked into Canaan, built his altars at Shechem and Bethel and Hebron, and received the promise that the territory surrounding those altars would belong to his descendants. The flood survivor and the covenant recipient were contemporaries. The man who had carried two of every creature onto a vessel of specific dimensions and watched the world he knew disappear beneath water was alive in the same century as the man to whom that world's territorial inheritance was promised. No commentary in the text notes this. No character invokes it. The numbers are simply there, available to anyone who adds them, and the tradition appears entirely comfortable, leaving the implication unelaborated. What the implication means, held carefully without forcing it into a conclusion it cannot support, is that the post-flood world was not as remote from the covenant narrative as the narrative's pacing sometimes suggests. The flood is not ancient history by the time Abraham receives his call. It is living memory accessible through a single conversation with a man who was there. And yet the world Abraham walks into is already populated by the Anakim in the hill country, already organized around the religious systems, the Babel dispersal established, already bearing the structural features that the three traces have been following. Whatever happened between Noah's altar and Abraham's altar happened quickly in a world where the primary survivor of the event that was supposed to reset everything was still breathing and presumably talking. The mechanism of the Nephilim's reappearance is the place where the text's silence is most complete and most conspicuous. Genesis 6's phrase, and also afterward, does not gesture toward an explanation. It does not name a second incursion, does not invoke the Watcher tradition, does not offer a genealogical account of which line carried the relevant genetics across the flood boundary. It simply notes the reappearance as a fact and continues. The Enoch and Jubilees traditions fill this silence with specific mechanisms, the 1/10 of disembodied spirits, the second descent on Hermon, the targeting of the Canaanite population as the prepared ground for a new generation of hybrid unions. But those traditions are filling a silence that the canonical text deliberately, or at least consistently, maintains. Why the silence exists is itself a question. Ancient Near Eastern texts were not generally shy about explaining the origins of the things they described. The Mesopotamian creation accounts explain in considerable detail why humans were created, how they were formed, what materials were used, what purposes they were meant to serve. The Genesis account, which is not typically reticent about providing origins, provides none for the post-flood reappearance of the Nephilim. The absence of explanation where explanation would be expected is the kind of detail that resists both the interpretive frameworks available to us. It is not evidence of supernatural transmission, and it is not easily explained as literary convention. Consider the specific geography of Mount Hermon in relation to this silence. The mountain sits at approximately 33 degrees north latitude, a coordinate that certain traditions working from entirely different starting points and different methodological frameworks have identified as carrying unusual significance in the ancient world's organization of sacred space. The claim is speculative and contested, and it is offered here not as evidence but as a motif, a detail that, like the six-fingered giant and the 217 flood accounts, belongs to the category of things that are too specific to be comfortably dismissed and too ambiguous to be confidently confirmed. What is not speculative is that the Herman tradition in the Enoch literature is precise about the location, precise about the oath taken there, and precise about the number of participants. 200 watchers, 20 named leaders. A binding oath that the text describes as chosen because it distributed guilt equally. If they all fell together, none could claim ignorance or seek individual mercy. The precision of the numbers and the logic of the oath structure suggest a source tradition that was working from something more specific than general mythological convention, even if that source tradition cannot be traced beyond the Enoch texts themselves. The polydactyly of the Gath warrior belongs in this same category of inexplicable specificity. 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, the detail appears in 2 Samuel 21, without commentary noted as a distinguishing characteristic and then left alone. Modern genetics recognizes polydactyly as a dominant trait with a known inheritance pattern, meaning that if a founding population carried the relevant allele, it would appear with predictable frequency in subsequent generations. The Gath warrior's polydactyly combined with his unusual stature and his explicit identification as descended from the giants produces a cluster of physical characteristics that the text treats as co-occurring rather than coincidental. Whether this represents a genuine biological signature of a specific lineage preserved across the centuries of the conquest period, or a literary convention for marking beings as outside the normal human category, the text does not say. It simply notes the fingers and moves on in the same register of matter-of-fact observation that it uses for everything else, as if the detail were ordinary enough to require no elaboration, while being specific enough to require recording. The pattern that all of these silences produce assembled together is not a pattern of concealment. It is a pattern of assumption of a tradition that expected its readers to be carrying background knowledge that would make the unelaborated details legible without explanation. The 6 fingers, the arithmetic of Shem's lifespan, and also afterward, the precise numbers on Herman. These are the marks of a text writing for an audience that already knew the framework the details inhabited, in the same way that a letter written between people who share a history can reference events without explaining them. What we are reading across these gaps may be the outline of a conversation whose full content has not survived a shape pressed into the record by the weight of something the tradition knew and no longer fully transmits. The landscape seen from a distance. Step back far enough from any set of details and what was a collection of individual observations becomes a shape, not a proof, not a conclusion, but a configuration that the details individually could not produce. The 9 chapters that precede this one have been close work following a genealogy through specific texts tracing a knowledge curriculum against a legal code mapping a mythology distribution across cultures and centuries, pressing on the objections and examining what they leave intact, following the geography of the arrangement into the prophetic literature and back. The work has been granular because the evidence is granular. It exists in particular numbers, particular names, particular variant readings of particular passages, particular skeletal dimensions and particular fish-shaped sages in particular Mesopotamian traditions. But granular work sustained long enough eventually earns the right to a different kind of seeing. This chapter is an attempt at that different kind of seeing. What the preceding traces collectively describe when held at sufficient distance is not a mystery in the conventional sense, not a puzzle waiting for a missing piece that will resolve everything into clarity. It is something more like a landscape with a specific feature that keeps reappearing regardless of which direction you approach from. The feature is this: the post-flood world was not a clean beginning. It was a continuation operating under different conditions of a conflict whose origin preceded the flood, and whose resolution the flood did not complete. Every trace that has been followed in this investigation arrives at the same structural observation through a different path. The bloodline trace arrives there through genealogy. The knowledge trace arrives there through legal history. The mythology trace arrives there through comparative anthropology. The geography trace arrives there through the spatial distribution of named categories in specific territories. 4 paths, 4 disciplines, 4 independent lines of inquiry, and the landscape they collectively map has the same dominant feature no matter which path you take into it. The feature is also not static. One of the things the distance perspective makes visible that the close work cannot is the directional movement within the pattern. The post-flood world does not simply reproduce the pre-flood world in miniature. It contracts, The giant lineages that appear diffusely across the ancient Near East in the generations immediately following the flood, the Rafaim east of the Jordan, the Emim in Moab, the Yamsor, Zamzumim in Ammon, the Anakim in the hill country. The unnamed giant populations the Table of Nations implies in the territories of Ham's line, these gradually concentrate across the centuries of the conquest period into a smaller and smaller geographic footprint. By the time of the Judges, they are largely confined to the Philistine coastal cities. By the time of David, they are confined to a handful of specific warriors named individually, whose deaths the text records with the care of someone closing a ledger. The pattern moves from diffuse to concentrated to eliminated across a time frame that spans roughly 8 centuries from the flood to David's final campaign at Gath. Whatever was re-establishing itself in the post-flood world did so in a way that the covenant narrative progressively narrows and eventually closes. The knowledge trace moves in a parallel but inverted direction. The forbidden curriculum that the Enoch tradition attributes to the Watchers begins concentrated, delivered in specific places by specific teachers to specific populations, but it spreads outward, carried by the Babel dispersal into every territory the 70 nations occupy, embedding itself in the religious system and magical practices of cultures across the ancient world. By the time the law code is delivered at Sinai, the practices it prohibits are not exotic or unusual. They are the standard operating procedure of every surrounding civilization. What the bloodline is doing contracting toward elimination, the knowledge is doing in reverse, expanding toward ubiquity. The law code stands at the pivot point of this inverted movement, attempting to hold a boundary against a diffusion that is already nearly complete. The covenant people are surrounded on every side and in every cultural register by systems that the Watcher tradition describes as deriving from a single transgressive source. The prohibition is not preventive. It is restorative, an attempt to recover a distinction that the expansion of the knowledge had nearly erased. Seen from this distance, the Babel event takes on a different weight than it carries in close reading. The confusion of languages is usually read as a punishment divine intervention against human pride, the scattering that prevents the tower from being completed. But the Deuteronomy 32 passage, with its assignment of the scattered nations to divine beings, reframes it as something more structurally complex. The scattering is simultaneously a punishment and an arrangement, a reorganization of the post-flood world into a structure that places specific spiritual entities in oversight roles over the 70 nations, while reserving the covenant people outside that structure entirely. What looks from close range like a narrative of pride punished is from distance the establishment of an organizational framework that will govern the spiritual landscape of the ancient world for the entire period the biblical texts describe. Every nation the texts subsequently describe as corrupted, idolatrous, given over to practices the law prohibits, every one of them is operating within the framework Babel established under the oversight of the entities the Deuteronomy passage assigns to them. The framework is not incidental to the story the texts tell. It is the stage on which the story takes place. What the distance perspective cannot resolve, and it is important to name this clearly rather than letting the elevated view create a false impression of comprehensiveness, is the question of origin. The pattern is visible. The directional movement within the pattern is visible. The structural framework within which the movement takes place is visible, at least in outline. What is not visible from any distance is the mechanism by which the Nephilim reappeared after the flood, the specific channel through which the 1/10 of disembodied spirits the Jubilees tradition describes actually operated on the physical world. The precise nature of what the Watchers were in terms that would satisfy a framework other than the one the ancient texts themselves supply. The landscape has a shape. The shape has a name in the tradition that preserved it. Whether the name corresponds to anything that a different kind of inquiry could verify is not a question this investigation can answer, because the evidence available to this kind of inquiry, textual, archaeological, comparative, does not reach to that depth. The texts go further than the evidence, and the honest position is to mark where one ends and the other begins. The bed of iron in Rabbath of the Ammonites, the arithmetic of Shem's lifespan, the Ugaritic tablets naming the Rafaim as participants in living ritual, the 217 flood accounts, the 6 fingers, the point-by-point correspondence between what was taught and what was prohibited. Each detail from this distance is a coordinate in a map whose full territory exceeds what the coordinates can define. The map is real. The territory it describes is still in its deepest registers dark. What the record does not close. There is a quality that certain very old questions share, not the questions that are old because they have not yet been answered, but the questions that are old because every serious attempt to answer them has revealed at some depth that the answering itself was the wrong ambition. The question of what crossed the boundary of the flood belongs to this category, not because it is unanswerable in principle, but because every path toward an answer opens into a larger territory that the answer cannot contain. You follow the genealogy and it leads to a legal code. You follow the legal code and it leads to a mythology distribution. You follow the mythology distribution and it leads to a geography. You follow the geography and it leads to a prophetic literature that is reaching in its own idiom for a framework large enough to hold not just the giant clans of the Canaanite hill country, but every system that follows the same logic across every century the tradition spans. At some point, the investigation is no longer about the flood. It is about what the flood was about. What the flood was about in the tradition that preserved it most fully was a category problem. The pre-flood world had allowed a boundary to dissolve the boundary between what the texts call the sons of God and the daughters of men, between the class of being that occupied one register of existence and the class that occupied another. The dissolution of that boundary produced something the texts describe with consistent unease: beings that were neither fully one thing nor fully the other, possessing capacities that exceeded the human frame while remaining subject to the mortality that defined it, carrying appetites that the world around them could not satisfy, generating violence as a structural consequence of what they were, rather than as a choice made within on an otherwise stable character. The flood was not in this reading a punishment for wickedness in the ordinary moral sense. It was a correction of a categorical error, an attempt to restore the distinction between registers that the transgression had collapsed. The waters returned the world to a state in which the categories were separated again. The boundary re-established, the registers of existence returned to their proper relation. The post-flood world failed to hold this restoration, and the way it failed tells you something about the nature of what the restoration was attempting. Boundaries do not fail because they are weak. They fail because the pressure on them is active, organized, and patient. What the traces followed in this investigation collectively describe is not passive drift, a world gradually and accidentally wandering back towards the conditions that preceded the flood. They describe something more purposeful, a second incursion targeting a specific territory, a knowledge curriculum delivered through specific channels to specific populations, a mythology distributed across the dispersed nations in ways that maintained in each cultural context the same structural claim that beings from a higher register had interacted with human women, that the offspring of those interactions were the ancestors of the noble and the mighty, that the knowledge delivered in those interactions was the foundation of civilization's most sophisticated achievements. The pressure on the boundary was continuous, adaptive, and specific in its targeting. It knew where the counter-narrative was running and organized itself accordingly. This is where the investigation passes out of archaeology and into something that archaeology was never equipped to address. The physical evidence, the skeletal remains, the stratigraphy, the cuneiform tablets, the variant manuscript readings, runs to a certain depth and then stops. Below that depth, the tradition continues, but it continues in a register that the tools of material inquiry cannot follow. The texts speak of beings bound in the valleys of the earth, of disembodied spirits roaming the landscape seeking embodiment of divine beings assigned to the oversight of nations at the moment of the Babel dispersal of a conflict between seed lines that runs not just through the genealogies of the ancient Near East, but through the entire arc of the tradition, from the garden to the final vision of Revelation. These claims are not falsifiable by the methods available to this investigation. They are not confirmable either. They exist in the space between what the evidence reaches and what the tradition asserts, and that space is depending on your framework, either the location of faith or the location of mythology, and possibly both simultaneously. What the tradition does in the texts that carry this conflict to its resolution is insist on a particular kind of ending. Not resolution through superior force, not resolution through the elimination of the adversarial entities by a power that simply outmatches them, but resolution through the completion of the very thing the adversarial pressure was designed to prevent. The seed of the woman in the Genesis 3 formulation that the tradition treats as the organizing promise of everything that follows was supposed to crush the head of the serpent. Every subsequent movement in the conflict, the Watcher, transgression, the flood, the second incursion into Canaan, the giant clans in the hill country, the Babel dispersal, and the assignment of the nations can be read within the framework the tradition supplies as pressure on that promise. Pressure designed not to defeat it openly, because the tradition presents that as impossible, but to complicate the conditions of its fulfillment until the fulfillment became practically unachievable. Fill the promised land with giant clans before the promised people arrive. Corrupt the bloodline through which the seed is supposed to run. Distribute a knowledge system that creates structural dependency on the adversarial entities across every nation in the ancient world, leaving no cultural space outside their influence. The strategy in the tradition's own terms was not to win, it was to prevent. The tradition presents this strategy as having failed in a specific place and through a specific mechanism that it describes in detail. Whether that description corresponds to historical events in the way that the genealogies and the conquest accounts correspond to historical events, or whether it operates at a different register, theological, cosmological, mythological in the deeper sense, is a question that this investigation cannot answer and was not designed to answer. What it can note is that the tradition's account of the failure is structurally consistent with everything that preceded it. The same pattern that governs the flood, the conquest, and the prophetic literature governs the resolution. The pressure is real. The stakes are genuine. The outcome is not achieved through the elimination of the adversarial force, but through the completion of what the adversarial force was trying to prevent. The boundary that the flood restored and the post-flood world failed to maintain is in the tradition's final vision restored permanently, not through water, not through military conquest, but through something the texts describe as the undoing of the original dissolution at a level deeper than the flood could reach. We will not resolve this tonight. That is not what this space is for. What this space is for is the slow following of a question through the layers of evidence that have accumulated around it, the honest acknowledgement of what the evidence shows and what it does not, and the patient recognition that some questions are old not because they await an answer, but because they are the kind of questions that remain generative precisely by remaining open. The flood happened, or something like it happened, or something happened that left its mark in 217 traditions across the inhabited world. The Anakim were in the hill country of Hebron, name described traced to a genealogy the record treats as significant. The law code prohibited what the transgression tradition says was taught. The numbers in Genesis 11 place Shem in the same century as Abraham. These things are in the record. What they mean at the depth the tradition reaches when it speaks of seeds and serpents, and the patient unfolding of a conflict older than the flood, is a question that the evidence outlines and does not close, and that the silence after the last chapter will hold more honestly than any answer could. The hill country in the evening light. Caleb was 85 years old when he walked to Joshua and made his request. The text records it with the directness of someone who has been waiting a long time to say a specific thing and intends to say it without ornamentation. "Give me this hill country," he said. "The hill country where the Anakim are. The hill country of Hebron where Ahiman and Shishai and Talmi had built their stronghold. Where the city of Arba, the greatest man among the Anakim," the text calls him in a phrase that carries the weight of a whole tradition, had given his name to the ground beneath its walls. 45 years earlier, Caleb had walked through that hill country as one of 12 scouts and had come back with a different report than the 10 who outvoted him. He had seen the same giants stood in the same shadow of the same fortified walls, understood the same arithmetic of human capacity against Anakim scale. He had simply reached a different conclusion about what that arithmetic meant. Now 4.5 decades later, the wandering completed the Jordan, crossed the southern campaign largely finished. He was asking for the one piece of territory that the 10 had pointed to specifically as the reason the whole project was impossible. The text notes almost as an aside that Caleb was as strong at 85 as he had been at 40. His vigour had not diminished. His capacity for war, he says, was the same coming out as going in. The detail is not medical. It is not offered as evidence of supernatural physical preservation, and the text does not frame it that way. It is offered as context for the request, a man making clear that he is not asking for the hard thing out of sentiment or nostalgia, or a desire to finish unfinished business before age made it impossible. He is asking because he is still capable, because the capacity is present, and because the hill country of Hebron is specifically the place where the capacity needs to be brought. The giants were still there, The walls were still standing. The Anakim had not cleared themselves out in the 45 years since the scouts had first described them. They were waiting in the hill country where they had always been for someone to come and do what the 10 scouts had concluded could not be done. What Caleb's request holds without naming it is the full weight of everything the preceding chapters have been following. The bloodline that crossed the flood had concentrated across the centuries of the conquest period into this specific hill country, this specific city, these specific named individuals. The knowledge curriculum that the Watcher tradition described had embedded itself most deeply in the Canaanite religious system that the Anakim's territory sustained and organized. The mythology that 217 cultures remembered was remembering, among other things, the kind of being that Caleb was now asking Joshua's permission to go and fight at the age of 85. The geography of the arrangement had been pointing here for the entire arc of the covenant narrative from the moment Abraham built his altar at Hebron and received the promise that this land would belong to his descendants to this moment, with an old man in a tent asking for the hardest piece of it. Joshua blessed him. The text records this without elaboration. He blessed him and gave him Hebron as his inheritance. And then Caleb went. The text does not dwell on the campaign, does not supply details of the engagement, does not describe the moment of confrontation between an 85-year-old shepherd, become general, and the sons of the man whose name the city still carried, and he drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak. The text states it simply in the past tense as a completed action. Ahiman and Shishai and Talmai, who had been named by the scouts 45 years earlier as the specific reason the whole project was impossible, were driven out. The city that had been called after the greatest man among the Anakim was renamed. It became Hebron, which the tradition associates with the word for fellowship, for joining, for the kind of bond between people that does not depend on the scale of what surrounds them. The hill country in the evening, the walls that had been built by people whose fathers had been described as something other than ordinary, standing in the light that falls differently at that elevation than it falls on the coastal plain below. The stones of Hebron are pale, almost white in certain conditions, the kind of limestone that absorbs the day's heat and releases it slowly after sunset, so that the walls remain warm to the touch long after the air has cooled. An old man's hand against that stone in the evening. After a campaign, the text describes in a single sentence feeling the warmth that the giant city had been holding all day and was only now beginning to release. The walls still standing. The names above the gate changed. The hill country claimed at last by the man who had always believed it could be. The record does not say what Caleb thought standing there. It does not say what he remembered of the first time he walked through young and afraid in ways he had not admitted to the 10 who voted against him. It does not say whether he thought of the flood or of Abraham's altar on this same ground, or of the arithmetic that Shem's lifespan implied, about how close the old world still was to this one. It simply records that he was there, and that the hill country was his, and that the Anakim were gone from it. The stones kept their warmth into the night. The question the investigation has been following kept its shape as it always has in the silence between what the record says and what it does not. Rest now, traveller. The bed of iron is still there in the record, 9 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, preserved in Rabbath of the Ammonites, the text says, as if whoever wrote it expected you to go and look. You cannot go and look. The city is buried under centuries of other cities, and what the text was pointing to has long since passed beneath the accumulated weight of everything that came after. But the gesture remains, the pointing remains. Someone thought it important enough to note the location to fix the measurement in writing, to treat a piece of furniture as evidence that deserved to be findable. That instinct to preserve the specific thing, the dimensioned thing, the thing that could be verified, is the same instinct that preserved the genealogy, the legal code, the names of 3 brothers in a hill country stronghold, the arithmetic of a lifespan that placed a flood survivor in the same century as a covenant recipient. The record kept its details. What the details add up to has never fully settled. That is not a failure of the investigation. It may be the most honest thing the investigation can offer. We move through the ancient record the way you move through a landscape in low light. The shapes are real, the distances are genuine, the ground beneath your feet is solid, but the edges of things blur in ways that make certainty feel like the wrong ambition. The flood happened, or something happened, and 217 traditions remember water. The Anakim were in the hill country, named, described, removed by an 85-year-old man who had been waiting for 45 years for the chance. The law prohibited what the transgression taught item by item with a specificity that implies someone had seen the curriculum. These are not interpretations, they are coordinates. What the coordinates map is a territory larger than the coordinates can fully describe, and that gap between the map and the territory is not a problem to be solved. It is where the question lives. History is always like this if you follow it far enough. Not a sequence of settled facts receding cleanly into the past, but a series of impressions left in materials that were never designed to last. Clay pressed with reed stone, carved by hands whose names are gone. Oral traditions filtered through centuries of retelling, until the original voice is somewhere underneath the accumulated versions present but unreachable. What arrives to us is fragments, and the honest response to fragments is not to paper over the gaps with confident conclusions, but to hold the pieces lightly, to notice what they suggest, to let the shape they collectively imply exist without forcing it into a frame too small to contain it. The hill country of Hebron holds its warmth into the night. The pale limestone that absorbed the day releases it slowly after the sun is gone, so that the walls are still warm, hours after dark, still carrying something of the light they received. The question this investigation followed is something like that, old enough to have absorbed centuries of inquiry, warm in ways that outlast the specific moment of contact, releasing its heat slowly into the silence that surrounds it. You have been in contact with it tonight. You do not need to carry it further. You can set it down here in the dark and let the warmth it gave simply be what it is. A reminder that the record is deeper than any single reading, that the questions the ancients lived inside are still open. That the stones of Hebron are pale and old and still standing in the hill country, where an old man once pressed his hand against them and felt in the heat they gave back everything the walls had witnessed. Perhaps the flood left more than the sediment. Perhaps the memory it left in 217 traditions is itself a kind of preservation, not of the event alone, but of the understanding that certain things once dissolved take longer to restore than the water takes to recede. Perhaps the texts do not close on this, neither do we. Let your breath slow now. Let the names Ahiman, Sheshai, Talmai, Shep, Henkalab, Erbu recede into the distance, where all old names eventually settle present, but quiet, no longer requiring anything from you. The investigation is complete for tonight. The questions remain as they always have, patient in the dark. Sleep well. Traveller, the hill country is still there in the morning, and the stones remember everything.